What's up? It's Canucks this week. Happy New Year, Dan Riccio and Randip Janda. And what have we been doing this holiday season, Randip? Well, we've been watching Connor Bedard, just like every other team that is below the playoff line in the NHL. Should the Canucks be asking themselves, should we be tanking harder for Connor Bedard?
Can you imagine heading into the season with Elias Pettersson, Quinn Hughes, Bo Horvat, JT Miller, Thatcher Demko in your lineup? And now, here in January 2023, asking that question? Yes, the Canucks should be asking that question based on the fact that look at the team game right now. Goals against, they're ranked 30th in the league. Penalty kill, as of right now, the worst in the history of the league. Let me repeat that. The worst in the history of the league. So
actually, if you go over the last 82 games they've played, it is the worst in NHL history. So
yes. I'm talking about this season, and they're worse than the LA Kings from 1979 to 1980. So that's how bad.
I remember that Kings team, man. They were bad.
No,
they were real bad.
No, you don't.
No, I don't.
You weren't born at that point. But my point here is, yes, expectation was one thing. The team, the coach, everybody was saying, if we don't make the playoffs, it's a disaster. It's heading towards a disaster. It's almost a halfway point, and you're at that situation now. You have to start doing some long-term thinking. Listen, this team thought there were a bunch of Michael Corleones. They turned out to be Fredos. That's what's going on here. They just can't get the job done. So to me, that's a conversation that you need to have right now for the Vancouver Canucks and saying, all right, what's the long-term focus? Is it now or is it 2 to 3 years from now? That's a very real conversation.
I don't think that there's too much debate for me as to which direction the front office is headed going into the trade deadline. And as we get closer to the end of the season, the very cynical part of me is wondering, if they haven't moved on from Bruce Boudreau because they saw this as one of the outcomes and said, oh, maybe this season isn't worth saving. Let's see if he can figure it out. And he hasn't been able to. Remember, everything they said about Boudreau, all of their question marks, all of their concerns have sort of come true here in the first half of this season. But tank harder for Bedard? Sure, it's easy to say, and it makes for great clout on Twitter, but the time for tanking with this team was at last year's deadline. They should have traded JT Miller then. They should have moved Bo Horvat in the summer, and they shouldn't have gone out and added Ilya Mikheyev to this roster, Curtis Lazar, Ethan Bear, who's been actually one of their better defensemen despite that ugly giveaway against the Islanders. They shouldn't have added any of those pieces. They should have tried to move on from a Connor Garland or a Brock Besser, make it more of a priority to move on from them in the summer. They had opportunities. It's just they weren't getting much back in return, maybe having to take money back as well in some cases. So it didn't really make a lot of sense for them to do that unless they were really tanking for Connor Bedard. And when they signed up for this gig, we know that tank wasn't really in the conversations with ownership. They were on the same page that it was going to try and be a quick retool here in Vancouver. And that's why they haven't gone down the road of tanking harder for Bedard. But now you have no other choice this season. You've got to do whatever you can to lose as many games as possible.
That's the reality here as well. And I know anytime you mention a draft lottery, people start to have nightmares in the city of Vancouver, and justifiably so. It hasn't been a good history. But here's the conversation. Connor Bedard is one of the options that you would have in this draft. This is a very deep draft. So if you're considering, obviously the local kid who has ties to the Canucks, he's a fan. I asked him a couple of months ago on whether he still watches Canucks games, and he said, yes, he does. So there's a connection to this very day for Connor Bedard. But even beyond that, you have a very deep draft class that you should be able to get an impact player for your organization. Now, beyond that, if you start looking at, all right, was this an option previously? Well, the 57-game sample size that Bruce Boudreau got was nice. But as you mentioned, Jim Rutherford and co said, show me. Show us that you can change the structure of this game. Show us that you can have a team game. And then the games against Winnipeg, Calgary, and the Islanders specifically, those three teams, and especially Winnipeg and the Islanders, I would say, have team games. They play as a unit. Vancouver did not have anything that resembled that. So if anything, that shows you where it's at right now. That shows you where the coaching situations at. That shows you where some of these individual players are at. And that shows you how far the Canucks have to go to get into that conversation of being a legit threat in the playoffs. Not a legit threat to make the playoffs, a legit threat to actually do something in the playoffs, because that should be the goal for any team in the NHL.
You know, one of the issues with this team when Jim Rutherford and Patrick Allvin took it over, Randip, is they were already locked into a lot of players, right? Locked into a lot of contracts, locked into Oliver Ekman-Larsson, locked into Tyler Myers, Tanner Pearson. Connor Garland had a fresh new contract. Brock Besser was in a situation that was very difficult to manage. It was, as we know, last summer, it was either lose him for free or give him a short-term extension. And they went for the latter, hoping that Besser would find his game. And points-wise, you know, he's on pace for another 60-point season. But we all know Brock Besser hasn't been anywhere close to his best from an overall game perspective. That's why, you know, this whole, the Canucks should have been tanking. I mean, when this front office took this group over, it was very difficult to do some of those things. So even now, I wonder, as you get closer to the deadline, what are those moves you could actually make to try and help this roster along to a better lottery percentage?
Okay, if you are trending in that direction, let me say this before we start talking about specific players. It's still going to be extremely difficult to be in that conversation because
remember, you're not going to be as bad as Chicago or Anaheim.
Montreal's trending in that direction. They had a terrible road trip. You know, Arizona's trying really hard, but it's only halfway through the season. The other half, it could be pretty ugly for that team as well. So there's going to be some bad teams in the NHL. But Vancouver does remind me of the Philadelphia of last year. Sure, they got talent on the roster, but they're having a terrible season, and there's a lot that's gone awry. Now, when you start looking at individual pieces, it's got to start with the captain. And I love Bo Horvat's game. I love what he's been able to do, not only this year, but in previous years. But when you're an unrestricted free agent, you've got him on, you know, what he's doing. The value is sky high. And if you are taking a step back to move forward in the long term, you have to ask yourself the question, how much can you get in return for this player who keeps on scoring almost every single game? He's got 9 multi-goal games this year, leading the NHL, and by a pretty good margin at that. You have to start there, Dan.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious where that's headed. Now, I know the Canucks are probably going to at least try and extend Bo Horvat one more contract extension offer, but I think we all see where this conversation is headed. It's not in a direction that sees Vancouver keep their captain here long term. Now, there's other pieces, right? You've got Luke Schenn as an unrestricted free agent. He's impressed, you know, like few other Vancouver Canucks have. And, you know, there's talk. I know Elliot Friedman and Jeff Merrick mentioned maybe a first-round pick could be on the table for Luke Schenn, which seems wild to me. But there was a rumor that the Canucks were offered a second rounder at last year's deadline for Luke Schenn when he still had a year left on his contract. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that they get a decent asset there and lose a real quality veteran piece off of their roster.
On that note, though, Luke Schenn playing on the third pairing with Travis Dermott has really submarined his minutes. He's playing around 12 to 13 minutes. Is that best first trade value? If that is the way you're going, does not playing him with Quinn Hughes actually make more sense in terms of raising that value? So yes, he may be an option, but usage is telling me something else right now where I don't know if that's great if that's the road you're taking. I don't know if that's the play.
Andrei Kuzmenko is the other unrestricted free agent, at least big one on this roster. And look, he's been everything the Canucks could have asked for when they signed him to an entry-level deal coming out of the KHL. But, you know, if the number is, if he wants, let's say, the Artemi Panarin 4-year, $24 million contract that he got coming out of his entry level with Chicago way back when, that's a pretty rich contract for a guy on a very short sample size. I've liked everything I've seen from Kuzmenko, but, you know, I think that's sort of the number where you're like, I don't know, what can we get on the trade market for this player? Because that's pretty expensive for a team that may not be winning anytime soon.
No, and Kuzmenko's done everything you've asked him to do here in Vancouver, playing alongside Elias Pettersson. He's been dynamic. His shooting percent is through the roof. He's, you know, when he ends up scoring points, they generally win. There's 11-1-1 when Andrei Kuzmenko puts up a point this season. So that tells you his importance to the team. But, you know, if you're paying him $6 million, let's just say that's the deal. You got to subtract from somewhere else. You got to make sure that you make moves elsewhere. And you mentioned, Brock Besser, you mentioned Connor Garland. They don't have any trade value right now. And the player that I'm going to bring up has been in the news a lot, not an unrestricted free agent. But yes, I'm going there. JT Miller.
It's not happening.
For various reasons, but if you're the Canucks at this point in time, I know you just extended him last summer.
Yeah.
But are you at least not listening? And the return might not be substantial, but cap space is really, really valuable right now. And JT, I think the expectation of him being a 99-point player again, if you had that, you weren't paying attention to the rest of his career. It's extremely difficult to hit near 100 points for a player, but a point per game and making improvements to the defensive side and being a reliable player offensively was expected. And thus far, he hasn't been able to do that. So if you are now changing the game and you're looking at a rebuild rather than saying, hey, we're bringing back the crew and trying to go for the cup, are you not at least considering up until the summer where that that no trade clause kicks in, are you at least not considering moving JT Miller?
I would have to say, yes, you consider it. There's only one untouchable, as we know, on this roster. It's Elias Pettersson. Should also be Quinn Hughes, but that's neither here nor there.
We agree on
that. I can't believe I'm actually defending JT. He hasn't been as bad as people make it out to be this year. The turnovers are bad. The emotions, the body language, all of those things, yes, are true. Don't love to see it, but he isn't wrong.
You forgot the bad changes, by the way, the bad line changes.
Oh, everybody has bad line changes. People are calling out JT.
If they're happening,
People are calling out JT for that play in Calgary on Saturday. Bo Horvat's line change on that play was even worse.
You know what?
Worse because he had an actual chance to make a play on Mackenzie Weegar there.
If Bo Horvat is scoring like he is right now, I'm willing to overlook some deficiencies. JT's not doing that right now, Dan. You can't argue on that. JT's not outscoring his problems.
That's fair. Okay, all of these things are fair. JT has to play better. I don't care about the bad body language and all these different types of things. If you are playing better, I will overlook those things, just like he did last year when he was getting 99 points and doing all those things. If he's back to a point-a-game player and outscoring some of his issues defensively, then nobody's going to have a problem with JT. The problem is, who are you trading JT to? Nobody has cap space around the league. You're going to have to take some money back, and there's nowhere near the offer on the table that you were probably getting at last year's deadline or some of the offers they fielded in the summer, which they believed to not be sufficient enough for the player they were giving up. And they decided we're going to sign one of Horvat or Miller. They chose Miller. Nobody loves it, but that is their bed, and they are sleeping in it now.
Okay, you said who is trading for JT Miller? I have one team. There's a gentleman that we interviewed a couple of years ago, and he gave us the quote of the century, Jarmo Kekalainen.
Oh.
Always looking to make a big move.
Yeah.
Local guy, JT Miller, and Columbus is in a bit of a reset themselves. They need to add some talent. They got cap room. So you asked the question, I will provide an option at the very least. But JT Miller, in my opinion, is somebody that you could at least, if you're trying to change up the room, because this is something that's big. A buzzword that's been coming out of Vancouver for the last year now with this new regime is culture. They want players that can win. They want players that hate to lose. JT's definitely that. But if you're trying to shake it up, it's not simply just Bo Horvat. I think you have to look at JT Miller as well as a potential if you're looking 2 to 3 years down the road rather than win now mode.
Should the Canucks be doing everything in their power to get the hometown kid playing at Rogers Arena in Canucks colors next season? Should they be tanking harder for Connor Bedard? How do they do that? Let us know in the comments. We'll respond to as many as we can. It's Canucks This Week. Subscribe to the Sportsnet channel, and we'll see you in next week's video.